Olá, bem-vindos a mais uma edição das Conversas Vadias sobre a Europa e o mundo. No final do ano, fomos todos surpreendidos pelas manifestações que eclodiram no Irão depois da morte de Mahsa Amini, uma jovem que morreu depois de ter sido detida pela polícia de costumes iraniana por usar o lenço deixando parte do seu cabelo à vista. As ruas foram invadidas por milhares de homens e mulheres gritando o slogan "Mulheres, vida, liberdade". De repente, o povo iraniano rebelava-se contra o regime dos Ayatollah e clamava por democracia, liberdade e respeito pelos direitos humanos. Protestos que têm vindo a ser violentamente reprimidos pelos guardas revolucionários. Um pouco por todo o mundo, a comunidade iraniana e muitos cidadãos de diferentes países têm vindo a manifestar-se contra a repressão promovida pelo regime iraniano. O Parlamento Europeu tem acompanhado a evolução da situação no Irão e na última sessão plenária, durante a evocação do Dia Internacional da Mulher, foi prestada homenagem à luta das mulheres iranianas. Além disso, o caso de envenenamento de jovens raparigas foi também alvo de um debate durante a sessão plenária, na qual foram pedidas sanções contra a Guarda Revolucionária. Hoje temos como convidada Azadeh Kian, uma académica irano-francesa, professora de Sociologia, diretora do Centro de Estudos de Género e Feminismo da Universidade de Paris e uma das mulheres da diáspora iraniana mais consultadas em todo o mundo sempre que se fala do Irão. Azadeh Kian, thank you so much for your participation in these talks. In the West, we tend to look at Iranian society as a closed and not very modern society. This is a very biased idea. Do you want to talk with us about this conception, this view that we have about the Iranian society?
Yes. First, let me thank you for this talk. I really very much appreciate it, Mrs. Santos. Actually, Iranian society has become a very modern society. 75% of all Iranians live in urban areas. Almost all children in Iran from age 6 to 24 are literate, and the literacy rate for all Iranians is approximately 90% in urban areas and only a bit less in rural areas. So this is a very modern society. For instance, fertility rates for women in Iran is only 1.6. That is much lower than in France, for instance. So this modern society where the number of female students in universities is approximately 3 million, that is 60%, 70% of the entire university students, also want modernity in politics. They want democracy, they want freedom, including freedom of choice to wear whatever they want, to wear the veil or not to veil, for instance. But this is overall a very modern society, open to the outside world, where, for instance, the social media and internet have taken a very important part in mobilizations, as we could see in the past 6 months. And also a lot of young Iranians who go to university usually speak a foreign language, basically English. And so they can read and they can see what's going on outside Iran. And they want also, and they aspire to ordinary life. They want to live as they want, and they are fed up with all these restrictions put on them and their lives by this Islamist regime in power for the past 44 years.
Last November, you said that the crisis in Iran is a revolution aimed at regime change, not just a civil society protest. Do you think these protests are different from others we have seen in Iran? Can they really lead to a regime change? Or after all these months, after 5 months, you think that this situation is changing?
Well, my understanding, as you mentioned, was that we are in a revolutionary process, which does not mean that the regime will change tomorrow. It means nonetheless that contrary, for instance, to the green movement of 2009, where millions of Iranians also took the streets to protest. But in 2009, they were basically educated middle classes, both men and women, in large towns who did participate in the movement, and they just wanted reforms from within the regime. They did not want to change the regime, but wanted to reform the regime from within. Then, of course, they were repressed. Many of them were imprisoned, and many were killed. Then again in 2018 and 2019, Iran was faced with very important revolts in the different parts of the country, but the major ones who were involved in these revolts were young, unemployed, and poverty-ridden people. What happened today is that, first of all, this is an ongoing revolution that started with women. Women are at the forefront of the movement. Women, especially young women, with their own demands, that is freedom of choice, equality. And then very shortly after they started, very quickly afterwards, we saw that young men and then other men also joined in. And today you have a movement very quickly that became a very generalized movement with different social groups and social strata involved. For instance,
and these movements, excuse me, but these movements are in the big cities or are spread around the country?
They are spread throughout the country. Let me give you some examples. For instance, when I say that workers joined in, a lot of these workers who joined and were on strike and even demonstrated, and many were either killed or imprisoned, were also from peripheral parts of Iran, but also central parts of Iran, from small towns to big towns, and then especially in some provinces that are lived by ethnic and religious minorities, especially in Kurdistan and in Baluchistan. You have a very important movements in different towns and chief towns or smaller ones, but also it spread not only to Tehran, but to Mashhad, the second largest city, Isfahan, third largest city, and also small towns that are in different provinces, and even some villages started to join in, because peasants, one should not forget, although they are a minority and they only constitute less than 20% of the population today, but even they are very fed up with the Islamic regime. This is a regime that is also being contested by the Bazaris, that is traditional middle classes who really benefited at the beginning from the movement, the Islamic regime, who were the pillars, one of the pillars of the Islamic regime. And today, even they are very angry, and they protest against the same regime. They close down the bazaars, for instance, in many towns to protest. So you have a whole lot of people, young ones, older ones, different social strata, from university students and professors to other, instructors, other strata of the population, so they are they basically protest against politics undertaken by the regime, against the imposition of religious precepts, against also economic policies that were undertaken by the regime, and so on. So this is what I call a general type of protest, which is very different from previous ones. And this is why I think that this is a revolutionary movement in process. And we could see that thanks to this movement, several, people who used to also support the regime started also to protest, from some clerics to some military to some policemen. So we know that if the movement continues, and there is no reason why it shouldn't continue, because people are not satisfied, they have not given any responses to their demands, then we can foresee that more people within the regime would start taking their distance from the decision makers, and I should say to this revolutionary movement that is a regime change. And this is what Iranians want. But as you know, the regime has committed harsh repressions. They have even executed several people in Tehran, in Kurdistan, in Baluchistan, in order to dissuade others to take part in street demonstrations, which led people to change the way they protest. We saw much less big street demonstrations, with the exception of Baluchistan and Kurdistan. But there are other types of protest movements that are at work, including strikes. So the entire regime is being, again, contested by the population.
How do you foresee the consequences of democratic change in Iran for the region and in the global geopolitics?
This is a very good question, because what Iranians are demanding is the separation of religion from the state. Their struggle is against political Islam that came to power 44 years ago with its laws and institutions, restrictions, and harsh repressions. So it is against political Islam. As you know, the Islamic regime of Iran has spread its authority and power throughout the region, in Iraq, in Lebanon, in Syria, in Yemen, and elsewhere. And so if this movement succeeds in overthrowing the regime and overthrowing the political Islam, and if it succeeds in bringing a new power in which religion and state are being separated, it will undoubtedly have a very important impact on the entire region. One should not forget that in all these countries around Iran, people also are struggling against political Islam, against the Islamic regime's influence in their own countries. And so what is going on in Iran would be very important for the entire region if the movement succeeds, but also, I should say, for Europe, not only for the Middle East, but also for Europe.
Yes, I'm sure. There have been several calls for the support of European Union to the civil society in Iran. At this stage, what should European Union be doing for supporting the Iranian civil society?
One important thing that Europe can do is to refuse to discuss and negotiate with the Islamic regime. I know that the Islamic regime is trying to say that if there is no negotiations around the nuclear issue, they will, probably want to enrich uranium even further than 60%. The threat of an atomic bomb is very useful for the Islamic regime to bring Europeans and Americans to negotiate JCPOA. But this will be very, very, very much to the detriment of Iranian movement, Iranian ongoing revolution, because this would mean that Western democracies will recognize the Islamic regime. We know that Chinese, we know that Russians who are very close to the Iranian regime now are all against Iran having an atomic bomb because it will, as you know, change the entire region and everybody else, beginning from Saudi Arabia and Turkey, would also like to have their own atomic bombs. So I am pretty sure that China and Russia won't let Iranians, create, produce their atomic bomb. This is just threats from the Islamic regime. Europe, if they want to negotiate, should set important limitations on what the Islamic regime is doing against the Iranian civil society, of course. At this point, I think that Europe should not negotiate with the Islamic regime, should not recognize this Islamic regime, should continue to also, as Europe is doing, and especially European Parliament is doing, to support the Iranian civil society. For instance, Iranians need some communication devices in order to communicate with each other. As you know, the Iranian regime has cut internet, is cutting internet, so people do not, are, really having difficulties getting in touch with each other. So this is something Europe probably can do, through technological aids to Iranian civil society. Second thing is that people who are on strike, such as workers, such as employees and so on, need financial help in order to continue their strikes. And again, people need to send money to Iran. So maybe Europe can help facilitate these transactions. But on the other hand, Europe, through negotiations with other countries, can most probably bring other countries also to condemn the Iranian Islamic regime and bring them to support the Iranian civil society, which is not for the moment the case, as you know, of all countries. And also, as you know, the European governments have not yet decided to apply what the European Parliament has voted for in the past 6 months. And so one of the demands of the Iranian society is also that the vote of the European Parliament with regard to Iran and its support for the Iranian civil society be respected by European governments, which is not the case for the moment.
In general, European Union is ahead of the rest of European institutions. So thank you very much, Professor Azadeh, for this dialogue, for having been with us. It was really a pleasure. It was really a pleasure to talk with you.
Thank you. The pleasure is all mine. Thank you very much for your support. I really, really appreciate it.
E assim terminamos mais uma das nossas conversas vadias, hoje sobre a situação vivida no Irão e os recentes protestos que mobilizaram milhares de homens e mulheres no Irão, contando com a presença da professora Azadeh Kian, uma das mais proeminentes especialistas em matéria política no Irão. Muito obrigada a todos. Até uma próxima Conversa Vadia.